Welcome to Birds in the Sky, the podcast where we explore how making art and music can be powerful tools for boosting mental health and well-being. Whether you're an artist, a musician, or simply someone looking for new ways to nurture your mind, we'll dive into creative practices, share inspiring stories, and uncover how the act of creating can lead to healing, self-discovery, and growth. Tune in and let your creativity carry you forward. I'm your host, Matthew Crane. Let's fly. Welcome, everybody, to today's episode of Birds in the Sky. I'm your host, Matthew Crane, and today's guest is Melissa Amacher. Melissa is an Air Force veteran, and we worked on a project together called the Odyssey Workshop, which is a photography-based program to get veterans engaged in the arts. And that's where we first made contact, but she's got some incredible stories. So first of all, Melissa, why don't we just talk about your role in the service? What branch did you serve in? What'd you do?
All right. So I was in the Air Force Reserves. I did 12 years out of Niagara Falls. Here at home, we do medical qualification physicals. So we have a dual mission. And then overseas, we are the entrance into the air evacuation system. So any of the coalition army or coalition forces that got hurt, we collect them and send them to Germany or the United States, or even just any medical facilities. Actually, around the world, they just go from like a hop to hop. So, and I was a medical technician, so it's the scope of practice is very different in the military. So we could actually challenge the LPN. So, but then we have readiness skills, wartime readiness skills. So we could do things if we had to, like casting, splintering, suturing, IVs. We're EMT certified, so a little bit different than just like your average
Absolutely,
tech. Yeah.
yes. People don't often see that side of the military as we wear a lot of hats, and you're required to do a lot of jobs because you're often in austere environments where you can't rely on having a full infrastructure of qualified people to work from.
Yeah, it's a lot of improvising and adapting to the things that you have right there.
Did you ever use duct tape? You don't have to answer that. Just kidding. So you're serving in the Air Force,
yes,
in the medical field. Any tours abroad, anything like that?
Yeah, I went to Iraq from end of October 2003 to March 2004.
Okay. What was that experience like? What part of Iraq?
We were at Baghdad Airport.
Okay.
So because of our job, we have to be at the flight line. So Baghdad Airport, we were right next to the Republican Guard headquarters building, which was pretty cool.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So needless to say that during that time period, there's a lot of injuries coming your way of various scope and level of care required. What were some of the common cases that came in? IEDs, I would imagine, is a big one.
IEDs was pretty big. So we had not just wartime related injuries. We also had, because people are driving erratically to not hit IEDs, we had automobile accidents, broken hips, broken legs. We had people, so because it's so new, and people are like in the activation system, people are still a little bit out of shape, having like some heart attacks. So we have medical stuff along with war trauma. IEDs are pretty nasty. We had some psych cases as well, because I think the reality is you can train as much as you want to train, but until you're actually in the situation, you just don't know how you're going to perform, how you're going to deal. And then I think probably the entrance into the military is probably a little different now for the screening versus back then, where maybe you didn't know you had a psychological condition, or maybe it just started because of your experience in the military. So we had a broad range of things. I hate to represent as all being like traumatic war injuries, being out there in the field, because it's not. But yeah, we saw a lot of different things.
I'm glad that you brought that up, and not having like your classic war injuries and stuff, because I had to go to medical once because I sprained my ankle shooting basketballs.
Yeah, exactly.
On some off time when I was deployed.
Yeah.
And that's embarrassing. You're like, oh, that's my war injury, huh?
Yeah, but I mean, you're out there. The infrastructure isn't so great out there, so it's very sandy soil. There's lots of like, potholes and divots, and we saw a lot of that stuff too.
Definitely.
Yeah.
And I've definitely driven in the Middle East, and I can understand the car accident thing. Though I've
Yeah.
never really thought about it,
Yeah.
it does make a lot of sense that you're going to get a lot of automobile accidents. You're driving in formation at 65 miles an hour sometimes.
Yeah.
So that's pretty wild. And when you're deployed, that's pretty much a full send kind of gig, right? What's the rotation like for the medical folks in like that kind of working environment? You get a lot of downtime, or you just go all the time, right?
No, we had one evening off. So I worked overnights. So we worked the 12-hour shift. So we worked 7 to 7. And I would say like 90% of the missions were done at night, just because you don't want to be a target. You don't want people to see what you're doing. It's very dark on the flight line. So we had one day off. But we didn't have missions every night so there's different levels of staging facilities. So when we first got there, they have to be gone within like 24 hours, the patients. So you can collect them, you take them on a quick mission. But then as we grew, we could keep our patients up to 72 hours if we had to, so there's like urgent and there's 3 different levels. There's like priority, urgent, and then something else. So those are actually determined by like they have to be out of country within 12 hours or out of country within 24 hours, and then the other like not urgent ones can stay up to 72. And that's what we're doing essentially is sending those medical patients to a higher level of care. So even though the Army took over the hospital in Baghdad, they have all these services, you can't keep them there. You can't rehabilitate them. They can't have time to heal. So the difference between like military medical and regular medical is very opposite. Like you're going to fix up the people that you can get to fix up to send them back out. And then the people you can't send back out, then you're going to send them to a different level of care. So like on the flip side, when you have, like I'm a nurse now, so all of your resources are to save the most critical patients, and then kind of everyone else after that gets treated.
Yes, I've had that experience as well in the civilian realm, where like I cut my hand once, and there's the scars here, and it was just all the way through to the bone, and it was just this flap of meat, and it just wouldn't stop bleeding. But I sat in the waiting room because they're like, "You're just really not a priority." Right. So, yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
So, 12 years in the Air Force Reserve,
Mm-hmm.
out of Niagara Falls Air Force Base. My grandfather retired from the Air Force out of there as well, so that's cool.
Nice.
So after your service in the Air Force, you transition into the civilian world.
Yes.
And you stay in the medical field.
Mm-hmm.
What was that experience like? As far as you briefly just touched on it, how it's kind of the opposite approach. What were some of your struggles trying to merge into a civilian-led healthcare system?
Well, one, so I was the dialysis technician. So when people's kidneys fail, they have 2 types of access. They go in.
As a civilian, when you got out, that's what you did.
Correct.
Got it.
Okay. So they either have an access on their arm or they have a catheter. So we can put big fat needles in their arm, blood goes out, goes back in. But I can't give saline if their blood pressure's low. I can't give Tylenol. There's nothing that I can do without telling the nurse.
Versus being in country or in the Air Force where you're qualified as a med tech to do those sorts of things.
Yeah.
Because it's logical and you're there at that time they need the thing. Right?
Yeah, and so in the military, the premise is that the doctors and nurses are going to be for those more critical patients. So we have to be able to take care of the rest of them. So, and even just the level of camaraderie, so we don't do assessments in the military, but I can go to a nurse and say, hey, this patient is doing this. Hey, this is what I see. And so we just report the things that could potentially get worse, where in civilian world, I can't even say I think there's something wrong with this patient. Technically I can't. When you work with your nurses or you work with your doctors and they get to know you, then they trust your judgment a little bit more, but you still have that hard line where you cannot do this. It's not your scope of practice.
And that's probably brought out of just the legal system that we have in the
Yeah.
civilian world, I'm sure.
Yeah, for sure.
That's unfortunate.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's definitely, so you felt kind of limited in you have all these abilities and skill sets, and that's a common thing for anybody who is in the service coming into the civilian world. You're given so much more liberties because your scope of work is so much broader.
Yeah.
You're required to know so much more stuff, but when you get in the civilian world, a lot of times we can't find jobs, or you're not trusted because you don't have a certain pedigree of schooling or something behind you. And it's like, we have the real world stuff that is 10 times more valuable than a textbook, somebody who read a textbook and took a test on it. Like, that doesn't tell you anything.
I think too, psychologically, that translates into, in the military, you have a purpose, right? You're very purposeful. You're like, so many people say, I lost my purpose after I came back overseas, and they struggle with that. Or even just people transitioning from active duty to civilian world. So like, you know, when you go in the military, your whole career is mapped out for you. What you do, your levels, like where you're going, like, you know, your mentors and you know your command structure, and then you get outside and you're like, I got nothing. Nobody's here to guide me. I don't have a purpose. I'm kind of just flailing. I feel like you're flailing like a fish sometimes.
Yeah, I have the exact same experience. Like when I got into the civilian world, nobody had anything that there was no sense of team, right? The purpose when you're in the service is that your people are relying on you, and there's a very critical and important mission, and it's regardless of what you think the military is, the mission for each of us is that each of us comes home and is safe. Other than that, we're told what to do, we do the things, but our real goal is to make sure we all come home. And that's the sense of team. When you're out in the real world, the civilian world, everybody's just kind of working to not get hassled by their boss, and they're waiting to the 3 o'clock or 5 o'clock, whatever time they get out. They're waiting to punch out with as minimal resistance as possible so they can collect a paycheck. And that's not fulfilling. I think that's a big part of the mental health problem, honestly. With that, I'm going to kind of change into the Odyssey project. And let's talk a little bit about that. I was in the first cohort that helped kind of get the program going, and it was huge for me. I had Steve Schultz on the podcast. He was my first guest. We talked about his experience. How did you get involved in that? And did you seek it out? Did somebody come in and say, hey, you should check this out? What was your experience into that?
You know, I'm not exactly, somebody sent me an email, but I think it was somebody from Veterans Court.
Oh, that's right. You sat on Veterans Court. We should talk about that, but just talk about Odyssey real quick and how we got in there.
Yeah, so I read this email and I woke up like, I got it on a Saturday. I woke up and I was like, kind of read it, you know, you're like looking at it with like one eye, and I was like, oh, this sounds pretty interesting. So I called the number and I was like, hey, can I talk to Brandon? And he was like, who is this? And I'm like, my name is Melissa. I just got this email about this project. And he was like, oh, okay. He's like, my name is actually Brendan. And he was like, I just had 2 people call me, like salespeople, and they call me Brandon. So he told me about it. He told me one of the reasons why he got into it about like taking care of his mom and some of the things that he learned from that. So I was like, oh, this sounds like a really interesting emotional experience. And it was so much more than I could ever have even imagined.
How so?
Well, you know, as a veteran, like you talk about things with other veterans that you would never talk about with other people.
Definitely.
But also just, just having people's experience, like talking openly about their experiences and their emotions is not something that people always do outside either. Especially like in the military, it's kind of like suck it up and don't talk about these things, and we're not going to deal with them. We're just going to shove them under the rug until everything's done. So that was it was interesting. It definitely piqued my interest.
Yeah. So it gave you a little bit of that community back.
Yeah.
That sense of purpose, even if your purpose was to go through this project or this workshop.
Yeah.
The workshop was to learn the basics of photography and how we can just kind of sometimes we can't talk about things, but we can take pictures. That was one of Steve Schultz's big things, is he didn't want to tell you what he experienced, but he could show you photographs
Yeah.
that kind of evoke that same kind of thing.
And for me, I struggled with that because I'm not artistic. But when I talked to Brendan the first time, he said, the Odyssey is, the purpose of it is to be able to tell your story of being at war and coming home through photography and through different projects each week. So that was interesting because I've learned to talk and communicate about my feelings, but for a long time, even just sometimes naming your feelings and understanding with PTSD what your trigger is now, but is it something that's bothering you now, or what is it in your past that's affecting your behavior or your thought process or that kind of thing.
Yeah, that's awesome. You have a tattoo on your left arm of an eyeball.
I do.
With an American flag. What is that about?
Okay, so when we were over there, so we're in tents. So
In Iraq?
In Iraq.
Okay.
We are at the airport, Baghdad. Everybody's sleeping. It's quiet. It's dark. So I see this guy sitting up. So I go over and I'm like, hey, what can I get for you? And I knew by his dressing that he's lost his eye. So he's like, I need a mirror. And I was like, oh, shit. So I said, give me a few minutes. I'll see what I can do. Like, I didn't bring a mirror. We're not.
You're not wearing makeup in Iraq?
Not wearing makeup. Don't have a curling iron. And I was thinking like the only mirrors that I saw were like the medicine cabinet mirrors, and I can't pick that off the wall and bring it in. So I got the chaplain and I was like, listen, it might take me a while, but I'm going to come back. So when I came back, he was up and chatting with the chaplain, and he looked at it and he said, I look like a monster. How can you look at me? How can you guys look at me? And I said, like other than your eye, all the stuff on your face that you see it's going to heal up nicely. And he was like, yeah, my kids aren't going to want to hug me. And I was like, they don't really give a shit about hugging, like what your face looks like. They're just going to be so happy that you're home. And I said, like, go buy a pirate patch from the Disney store. They don't care. Like, they just don't care. So I remembered his name. So that was 2003. So in 2019, we took this class. And I'm not even sure if like I shared the story during class.
Mm-hmm.
I can't remember because it was super
emotional.
Guarded. Yeah, I was very guarded about it. So at the end of class, we talked about the things that we would like to keep us in photography, like the interest. And I said, I would really like to find and photograph some patients that I took care of. See how they're doing, not necessarily see what they look like, but what is their healing process? How do they feel about themselves? Like, because some people really, really struggle with that. And other people are like, hey, this is what it is. I got to deal with it. So that was like the end of July, beginning of July that the class ended. So in the end of August, it was a tough summer. Like, I'm glad my daughter went to camp. I cried every single day. It was like,
going through the Odyssey project, do you mean?
Yeah.
That was part of the toughness?
That was like the trigger, is that like ripping a Band-Aid off. I hadn't confronted these feelings in 16 years. So the end of August, I'm like, you know what? I'm going to look one more time. If it doesn't happen, it's not meant for me to meet him or know him or anything. So I Googled it. I found an article about everything he said, how he got hurt. And I literally was shaking in my bed. And I was like, oh my God, I have to find him. This is him. So I posted it to our Facebook page, and one of the girls put something up there that she said, this might be a son. So I messaged his son and I was like, hey, sounds kind of crazy, but I was looking through your photos, and can you tell me the guy with the eye patch is your dad? So he's like, okay, hold on. So like 10 minutes later, he sends me his name and phone number, and he was like, he said it's really cool that you found him. So I called him and he didn't answer. So then he texted me a few minutes later, and he was like, I'm in Idaho. I can't talk. I don't have really good reception, but it's really cool that you found me. So we're like texting back and forth. And he said, like, everybody that I encountered was really good, especially the Air Force. They were so friendly. Like, there was nobody bad. And so I told him about that conversation, and he said, I thought you were a dream.
Wow.
So,
so he remembered you. He remembered the interaction.
Yeah.
But he just didn't have like a linear memory from the trauma, and just kind of thought you were like an apparition.
He thought it was just something that he dreamt.
Wow.
So, so that was 2019. So we messaged for like another maybe like 6 months. And I said, it would be really cool to meet. So he's in Houston with his wife. So like we planned this trip in March. COVID hits like 4 days before we're supposed to go and everything shuts down. So I was like, oh, come on, we're so close. So we ended up meeting the following year. So I'm like, okay, we're going to come down. We're going to meet at this restaurant. So we're outside of this restaurant. It has this giant armadillo. Now he's in Houston, so it's very
Texas.
Very Texas. So we're
Yeah.
taking pictures and I see this car coming around the corner and I start freaking out. So I'm with my best friend from high school and I'm like, that's him. I don't even know how it's him. I didn't even see him. I just know it's him. And she's like, just sit down and take a breath. So him and his wife walk up and we meet and he's like, fuck COVID, we're hugging. So we go in, we eat dinner, we're chatting. So, and his wife was like, this is great. Like, I'm so happy you guys you can meet. And I told her like my thought process and like from my perspective is that I thought about this for a long time. And I was really happy to meet him. And then the next day we went to the park and he said, my wife finally knows now, like when I'm quiet or when I need space or something. He said, I didn't really talk on the way home, but he said, it was amazing. He's like, I was so mesmerized by how my brain knew your eyes and your voice. He's like, it was actually kind of crazy.
Wow.
So, so we spent a few days down there. We did some other stuff. And then he said, I just want to thank you like for being tenacious because this is something I didn't even know I needed. So we still even now talk and text every once in a while. And then, so I told him before I went down there, I said, I hope you know that like you're a representation of all my patients, right? So I'm probably going to cry. I'm probably going to be emotional. And he's like, I don't care. I'm all about getting us all healed. So one of the things that he told me was that, so he was a Ranger for 17 years before he got hurt.
Okay. Ranger Battalion?
Yeah.
Got it.
He said, the only people that I would talk to were the people that were pulling the trigger. He said, nobody else was important to me. He said, I looked down on everyone. And he said, as soon as I lost my eye, I knew I had to, that was it. I knew I had to adjust to that. He's like, but the change, he said, they let me train for another year. They got a new commander and the commander pulled him and his friend off. And he was like, and that was like my downfall is that I was good enough for a year. And then after that, my whole identity changed. He said, and then, so the article that I saw was how he got hurt and how he used his adversity to help younger troops, like deal with them. He became a first sergeant and finished the last 3 years. But he said, it was actually the best thing that ever happened to me because I have friends. He's like, the food people, the logistics people, the medical people. He's like, I respect and love everyone now. He's like, I never would have even like spoken to them before because they weren't that important to me.
Right. You maybe just didn't understand the value and the, like you can't do your job without everybody else supporting you.
But he's like, I'm friends with people that I served with in those last couple of years. And
that's incredible. And all of this, and now I assume he's got an American flag prosthetic
eyeball, yeah.
And that is what your tattoo is. I'll put a picture up for those that are watching the podcast. And that's incredible. So that's the power of art right there. It wasn't, your story isn't about making art.
Yeah.
Your story is about like reconnecting and finding that purpose, and not the purpose, but that community that we lose, right?
Yeah, for sure.
Odyssey reconnected us. And I'm glad that you decided to take that workshop. I don't know if you're still making photographs now or still intend on doing that. Project sounds really awesome about finding patients. And were you able to take a picture of him and do a portrait, or you guys got selfies or anything at least?
We have a selfie. So I take trips often. So in this park in Houston, they have these words that come out of the ground, and they're maybe like 2 or 3 feet tall, and there are 6 of them. And it's like reflection. That's the one that we try to go to. Reflection, perseverance. I don't know, but they're not on the park map. They're the only thing that's not on the park map because they want you. The premise is you just walk through and find these words. So the word that I was looking for was reflection. So we're like walking around this park, and I was really frustrated because I couldn't find it. And they're like, "What are you looking for?" And I was like, "This word, it's reflection. It's not on the map." I said, I kind of like Googled it. And I said, but I think it's important because, for me, it's important because that is how I met you, is because you wanted to see your reflection. And now all these years later, we're meeting and we have this opportunity to reflect. So I had my camera with me, and have you ever been to Texas?
Yes.
They have those massive trees. So it's under this massive tree, and I let him go up ahead, and he's like standing at this word, and he says nothing. And I said, "Can I take your picture?" And he said no. So he never like said what he was thinking or anything like that. He was quiet for a few minutes after that, and then after he kind of came back around, I guess he said, we just finished spring break, and he's like, I didn't want this moment to be like a tourist break. Like, so I can respect that, you know. But he said I would never would have connected the two like that. So it's two very important moments of this interaction. And I told him, like, talking to you changed me as a person. It changed me as a caregiver because, I mean, I was not young. I was 27 when I went overseas. But until I met him, I didn't realize the personal impact of things. It's all about, sometimes when you're medical, and especially if you're like in emergency services, you're thinking of that injury. How do you fix that injury? How can you do this? And then that really made me think about, like, this is his story. This is his life. This is what he has to deal with. And he wasn't concerned about his vision. He was concerned about how people would they love him if he still changed? So he's like, that's great. And then, so originally with the eye, I didn't have the blood part on the bottom. We just added that like a couple weeks ago. And I said, hey, I made some adjustments to that eyeball. And he's like, oh, show me. So, and I didn't know how he would feel. Like, would it trigger him? Would it make him feel? And he was like, that is so cool. And I said, actually, because it's so much bolder, it's actually sparked a lot of conversation about it. And so for a long time, I was working at the VA, and all the guys knew that I was a veteran, but out here, people don't always identify as veterans. So when we talk about it, they're like, oh, that's so great. Like, it really has sparked, just like I said, you have that connection with veterans that you don't have with anybody else. And sometimes, so I'm not very artistic, but my tattoos are very, very personal. So that is like, sometimes they're like, oh, you got an eyeball? And I'm like, yeah. And other times I'm like, okay, let me tell you about this. This is a really cool story. So
it's an amazing story.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for sharing that.
Yeah.
I can't think of anything else to ask you. I'll have to get this guy's name if you don't mind, and I might reach out to him.
Sure. And I did ask him if it was respectful or not respectful to talk. And I was like, so one of the things that he had asked me was, you know, I told him what I did, and he was like, so what do you do with that? And I'm still trying to figure that out.
Still trying to work your way through that.
And the other couple things, during the project, we did that interview a veteran week.
Yes.
So I interviewed one of the nurses that I went overseas with. She lives here in Williamsville, and I went over after she put her kids to bed. She took out her box of stuff, and we were like going through things, and then she was reading me her journal. So when I was overseas, my stepfather passed away. So she was reading me her journal of that day. But then we were talking about like I remember the first patient. So our first patients that we saw were that first Chinook that came down. And like the first guy came in, he's got 2 chest tubes, and I'm like, and so I was like, so I went into the military as a different career field. So I didn't have clinicals. I didn't have those classes. I was like more of an occupational health kind of person. And we only dealt with flyers. So I was like, holy fuck, what did I just do? Like, that was my thought process. Like, I'm standing here frozen. Like I said, you don't always know how you're going to react until you're in the situation. So I was like, I don't know what to do, but I remembered his name. Those are the only 2 names that I remembered, was the guy from the first day, and then Chuck. And then, so we're going over these photographs, and my friend, I took a picture of her like crying. I said, this is where, as medical people, we don't always feel as worthy as the people that are out there in the fight. And one of the guys was like, he just turned around and he was like, that's fucking bullshit. I don't want to hear that. He's like, I'm a Marine, and my guys couldn't go out there without you guys. And he's like, so we have our story, but you have all of ours. So when Chuck asked me that, like, I don't know what to do with him, but I want to be respectful. But so I asked him, like, is it okay if I talk about you? And he's like, I'm about getting everybody healed. He's like, and I'm actually honored that you would talk about me.
That's beautiful.
So
your jobs are critically important. I mean, you get people back in the fight, but you also get them home to their families, right? My last guest was Kagan Gill. He survived the fastest ejection out of an F-18 aircraft. He ejected at the speed of sound.
wow.
2 seconds before his aircraft hit the water and vaporized. He he destroyed his body in the process, obviously entering that airflow, broke his neck. When the rescue swimmer was going to pull him out of the water, standard operating procedures was to get them on a board before they take them out. The week prior, this rescue swimmer lost guys to hypothermia because of trying to get them on a board in rough seas. A week later, this rescue swimmer is pulling my friend Kagan out of the water. No rest or downtime or anything like that, just hard charging back to doing the medical work.
Yeah.
Made a split decision, didn't put him on the board, didn't know he had a broken neck. Risky move, but ended up saving his life and getting him out of the water and to care because Kagan was floating around the North Atlantic for 2 hours. And he was hypothermic, and that's actually what kept him alive because the blood stayed inside of his chest cavity. But anyways, that first responder emergency care is, to me, more critical. Because you can't begin the rehabilitation process unless you survive the incident, right? You're still in the medical field, and it's still a demanding job, long hours, minimal sleep, and you're dealing with the lives. And that's, my hat's off to you because that's an incredible journey. Thank you for still doing that work. And thanks for coming by the podcast. I really appreciate it. Your story is powerful. Did you have anything else you wanted to talk about or anything like that?
No.
Well, thank you so much. Thanks for joining us, y'all. This is Birds in the Sky. I am Matthew Crane, and this is Melissa Amacher.
Yes.
I'm bad with last names.
That's okay.
Cheers. Thanks, y'all.